Hey everyone, it's Sarah, and today I'm going to show you how you can easily add Google Sign-In and Sign-In with Apple to your KMM iOS apps. So I'm here with the demo video, and if you've been following along, this is the iOS version of the Android version that we did in the previous video. So on the home screen, a user can click Sign In to start shopping, and let me go ahead and play the video and we can see how this works. So next, they're taken to a pre-built screen that's provided from Google, and this is called FirebaseUI, and you can easily add it to your Android apps as well as your iOS apps. So this is the iOS integration, and as you can see here, I have a Sign In with Google button and a Sign In with Apple. And this screen is customized. It has a custom logo in the middle here, as well as a custom background. So let's keep playing and see what happens. So first I'm going to sign in with Apple. And Apple prompts me to sign in with my Apple ID. And then here we go, let me pause this real quick. So now the UI can see that I've actually been authenticated from Firebase, and it switches to the sign out button back on the home screen. So let me hit play again. And I can sign out, and then I can sign back in if I want to. And then this time I'm going to go ahead and sign in with Google. So this goes through the Google OAuth process. And then again, it authenticates me from Firebase, and now I've authenticated with Google this time. That's the basic functionality. Next, I'll show you how this looks in the code. I'm here in my Android KMM app, and let me first go to my shared module, and we'll go over the dependencies. So I'm going to go into my build.gradle, and first let's scroll down and look at the common main dependencies. So what I've done is I've added Get Live Firebase Firestore, so I can communicate with Firestore in my shared module. And I've also added Firebase Auth in my common main, and that's so I can track the current logged in user. So in my user repository, I've added a new capability to see if the current user is logged in or not. And I can do this all from my shared module. I don't have to do it on the client. And now let me scroll back up here. And now this is really important. So in my CocoaPods block, in order to make this work on the iOS front end, I had to do a couple tricky things here. So I've added a pod for Firebase Firestore, and I had to say link only equals true. And the reason is because when I tried to add the pods to the iOS on the client side, I was getting some errors when I tried to compile. And what this means is to use some of the Get Live dependencies, the framework has to be isStatic equals true. But then I ran into a problem because if I say isStatic equals true, it breaks Moco because Moco has to be dynamic. So to get around this, you pass link only equals true. And what that does, this is from the docs, this parameter instructs the CocoaPods plugin to use pod dependencies with dynamic frameworks without generating C interop bindings. So once you say link only equals true, then I'm able to add the pods to my iOS front end, and I won't get any issues when I go to compile. So here I'm adding Firestore, I'm adding FirebaseUI Google, and FirebaseUI OAuth. And we add OAuth to do the Apple sign-in. And then finally, I'm adding Firebase messaging. This is something that I went over in previous videos. With my dependencies in place and everything working well on the client side, next I made some changes to my user repository. So let me go into common main, and I'm going to go into my data package, local, and user repository. Now what I've done here is I've imported the Firebase Auth. So I've got my Firebase Firestore and Firebase Auth, and these are both coming from the shared Get Live dependencies. Here, to get my isUserSignedIn boolean, I call Firebase Auth state changed. Now if you remember from my previous video when I was working on the Android client side, I created a callback flow to see whether or not the user was logged in, and that determined whether or not to continue showing the sign-in screen or to go back to the home screen. So what Get Live has done is in this auth state changed, let's go ahead into it, they've created a callback flow as well, and it returns a Firebase user. So if I go back here, this is the neat thing about Moco MVVM. So I can call this flow, and I can say map, and I want to return a boolean. If the user is not equal null, then I want to return true. And then I can cast this to a Moco C flow, which is really cool because then I can consume that flow in both Android and iOS. And then next, this is the upsert user function that we saw in the previous video. Nothing has really changed here. But then down here, I've also added a sign out method where I can easily just call FirebaseAuth.signout. And again, I can use this from both my Android and my iOS app. After working through both the Android and the iOS side, this was really the only functionality that I could put in the shared common module. Everything else really needed to live on the client side because it was so specific to either Android or iOS. So next, let's go ahead and head into Xcode and see how that works. Before you can start coding, first you'll need to set a few things up. So for starters, make sure that you've added your iOS app to Firebase and that you've configured your project, and add your Google Service Info file to the root of your iOS app directory. And this is really important because we're going to need this to configure the sign in with Apple. So next, let's click on iOS app, and we want to go to signing and capabilities. In order for the sign in with Apple to work, you're going to need a developer account. This is $99 and it takes about 2 days to process the registration, so make sure you do it ahead of time if you're eager to work on your project. And once that's all squared away, you're going to want to set your team. So I've set my team here, and you're going to want to have your bundle identifier. And now once you have your developer account, this is going to enable you to add capabilities. And sign in with Apple is called a capability. Now I've already added it here, but to add this, you just click on this plus capability, and then this is going to list everything that you can add to your iOS app. So you want to scroll down, I think it's towards the bottom, and it's sign in with Apple, and I've already selected it, so it's not available. But you would just select the capability and go ahead and add it. The next thing we need to do in Xcode is to add the URL to your Firebase app in order to complete the OAuth flow from Firebase to Apple. So to do that, we go to the Info tab, and you want to go to URL types, and what you want to do is you want to add your reverse client ID from your Firebase configuration as your URL scheme. And this is going to let your iOS app process the flow from Firebase to Apple. You can get this URL from your Google Service Info file. So let's head over to here. So you want to pick your reverse client ID and go ahead and copy this URL. To make this work, you're also going to need to add some additional items from your developer account. So let me go ahead and head back over to my Android app. I've created a couple screenshots for you so we can go through this flow. So first of all, if you're having problems adding your app ID bundle from Xcode, then you can go ahead and add your bundle ID from the developer portal. And to do that, you're going to want to add a new identifier and choose App ID. And then you can go through the process, and you're going to go through, I think I have this, yeah, I have this in the next screenshot. So you're going to go through and create your app, assign the bundle ID, and then just like in Xcode, you can add capabilities. So here you're going to want to add the sign in with Apple capability, and you can edit some configuration options. And once that's all squared away, then you'll have an app ID to configure additional properties. The next thing you're going to want to do while you're still in your developer account is go back to Add Identifiers. So you're going to want to click Identifiers, Add, and this time you're going to add a service ID. And now that you have your app ID identified as the primary app ID, you add a service ID, and you want to add a service to sign in with Apple. And you're going to assign that service to your app ID. And then this is where you can also configure the return URL, which we'll see from Firebase. So you can set up everything that you need in order for the whole flow to work between your iOS app and Firebase. Once you have everything set up with your app ID and your service ID, you're also going to need a key. So from your developer portal, go ahead and go to the Keys tab and click Add Key. And I've got a screenshot for this as well. So you're just going to want to add the key, and here I've added Apple push notifications, and I've also added sign in with Apple. So you're going to get this key ID, and together we're going to use all of this information and input it into Firebase, so Firebase knows how to talk with our app. Now, with everything set up on the Apple side, we need to head over to the Firebase console and configure things there. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you've added all of your providers in the authentication section. So here I've added Google and I've added Apple. And then once you've added Apple, that's where you can start entering all these IDs that we created from the Apple Developer Portal. So I'll show you what that looks like here. In Apple configuration in your Firebase console, you want to add your service ID that you've added from Apple. You want to add your Apple Team ID, the key ID, and now when you create a key, you're going to get a certificate that you're able to download. And you can download the certificate only once. So go ahead and make sure to do that and store it in a safe place. And finally, down below, Firebase is going to give you the return URL that you need to enter into the Apple Developer Portal. And this is going to be under your service ID. So you're just going to add this return URL here, and that way this is going to connect Firebase to Apple and make sure that your Firebase project can then talk to your iOS app. I know that's a lot of setup, and the steps can easily be missed. But luckily, Google has a really good guide online, and I'll make sure to include this link in the video's description. So here, if you click on Apple, they give you step-by-step instructions on how to integrate everything in the developer portal as well as the Firebase console. So as long as you have this guide, you really can't go wrong and miss any steps. With your settings configured, now it's time to add some code. So here back in Xcode, let me go into my iOS app. Now, in order for these return URLs and auth URLs to work and communicate properly, we need an app delegate. But I wanted to take a different approach. I didn't want to put this in my main app file. So what I do instead is, just like we did for Android, in my services package, I have a sign-in service, and I'm inheriting from FUI Auth Delegate. And what I do here is this is where I actually initialize the pre-built Firebase UI. So I call FUI Auth default auth UI. And then here I'm getting my user repo. We looked at this earlier. This is where I can get the flow of the current user and insert the user into Firebase, and I can also sign out the user from this repository. Next, I create a published isSignedIn var, and I'm not using this right now. Initially, when I wanted to collect that callback flow for the current user, I wanted to go ahead and put it in this file. So in order to make that work, I create this published variable here, and then I create an isSignedIn cancelable. And what that does is down here, I set this to create publisher, and its user repo is user signed in. And this is how we can collect that C flow from our shared module in Kotlin. So in iOS, we need to do things a little bit differently. And this is the subscriber publisher pattern. So I create this publisher, I receive it on the main dispatcher. This calls completion, and here I'm just printing it out. And then finally, in this receive value, I can actually get the value of that flow. So it's going to be a Boolean of whether or not the user is signed in, true or false. And then I call self is signed in to the value. But as I mentioned, I decided not to take this approach. I actually did something else, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But for now, let's go back up here. So when I initialize this auth delegate, then I go ahead and I set the delegate to self. I don't want to show the cancel button on the pre-built UI, so I hide that. Next, I set my provider array, just like we did in Android. So here I'm adding the Google Auth, and I'm adding the OAuth, which is the Apple provider. And next, finally, I make sure to set the Auth UI providers to this provider array. Down here, this is a convenience function to get the publisher. So this is a return value of any publisher, and it's going to be a Kotlin Boolean. And I return create publisher is user signed in. And this is cool. This is all built right into the Moco MVVM library. This Auth UI function is going to run when the OAuth process is complete and we have a current signed in user. So this is going to be our user value here, and I just print it out to make sure that I've gotten the user. And then I can do a little switch case here to see if the user canceled, if there was an error. And then down here, this is very interesting. This is where I need to call a suspend function from iOS into my shared module. And this is what's going to insert the user into the Firestore database. Now here we can run into some problems because this Auth UI delegate is running on the main thread. And in order to call this try await, we want to launch it on a different thread. And this really isn't supported by default in KMM, But let me go to my Android project. What you can do is in your main Gradle properties file, you just need to add this flag. So you add Kotlin native binary, and you want to add export suspend function launch thread restriction to none. And as long as you add this, you're going to be able to call suspend functions from your iOS code. So let me go back to Xcode and let's take a closer look and see how this works. So go into here. So I start my task and I call a do block, and then I want to try await, and I want to call my user repo upsert user. And then here I'm just passing in the unique user ID, and for now this token's going to be null. This is something that I'm going to do with push notifications in my next video. And then next, in this do block, I'm just catching the error and printing the exception. And once I get here, I know that the whole process is complete, so I call my router.shared.goback. And this is actually different from a previous video that I did, so let me go ahead into my router and show you what I changed. Before, I had my router set up as an environment variable that I was initializing in my iOS app. So we'll go back here. So before I was initializing my router here, and I was passing it here. But I can't do that because I wanted it to be available from my sign-in service, which is just a class. So in order to get a reference to the router from here in this class, what I needed to do was initialize this as an observable object. And then once I do that, just like in Android, when we would create a companion object, instead here, I call static let shared equals a new instance of the router. And what that allows me to do is back in my sign-in service, I can call router.shared.goback. So now I have a typed singleton of my router object, and my path is a published variable of a navigation path. And then in my go back function, I'm just calling path.removeLast, which is kind of like just in Android how we would pop the backstack and go back. This is great. Now I have everything wired up with my auth delegate. There's one more thing I'd like to show you before I move on. So let me go back into my sign-in service and I'll scroll down here. The one last thing I did was added this auth picker view controller. And what this does, this is what allows you to actually customize that pre-built UI. So I can call this and I can supply a nib name, which is custom Firebase UI. And then I provide my bundle ID and my auth UI. To get this to work with SwiftUI, the next thing I needed to do was create a custom view. So this you would just create, you would click on File, New, File, and for this instance you want to actually click under User Interface and you want to click View. So let me cancel out of this. So this is a custom view, and what you can do here is add customizations to this pre-built Firebase UI. And it's pretty cool stuff. Here I added a UI image view, and this is where that account logo is showing up. And now if I right click here, we see these referencing outlets, and the referencing outlet is set to account icon to the file's owner. To wire this up and to get everything working properly on the UI side of things, this view then needs a corresponding class. So I'll go into here and I have a custom Firebase view controller. Here I set an IB outlet for the account icon to a UI image view. And then down here on View Will Appear, I get my background color from my shared Moco color resources. And then once I have my background color, I go ahead and set the view.background color to that orange crush that we saw in the demo. And now I played around a little bit with the navigation controller, but I couldn't get that to change colors. So I included this link here, and in this link, this guide shows you how to completely cover the background and get rid of the navigation bar. So if you're looking to customize this even further, then you can just follow this link, and I'm sure with experimenting there's a lot more that could be done, but for now I just wanted to wire something up and get it working initially. And then down here I set my account icon.image to be my shared Moco image resources to the account icon that I created in my KMM app. Now finally, to get all of this to load and to make it compatible with SwiftUI, there's one more file that we need to have. So here I have my sign-in screen, and this is UI View Controller Representable. And what I do here is I get a reference to my FUI auth property, and then in MakeUI view controller, I call authUI.authUI view controller. And what that's going to do is it's going to go ahead and run through this auth delegate. It's going to pick up my custom layout, and it's going to run through, and let me go back here, and then it's going to return this UI navigation controller. And that's going to allow me to call this sign-in screen from my home screen. Next, let's see how this all ties together. So the home screen is calling the product list. So I'm going to go ahead and go into here. And now, because I've added Firebase, I've had a lot of problems with my previews. When I tried to load them, they just keep loading and loading, and they never resolve. And I did some research online, and that looks like it might have to do with my Firebase pod configuration. There's a couple ways to fix it. None of them looked easy, so that's something that I'm still exploring and that I'll still need to figure out. So for now, let's just get rid of it, the preview, and look at the code. We've seen some of this before in my previous video. So here I have my service result keys that's coming back from my shared view model. And now here, my sign-in service is an environment object. So my sign-in service is that auth delegate that's going to allow me to show the sign-in screen. Here I set up a router variable to the router.shared, which is that static singleton that we created. And then here I have a state variable, show sign-in, and by default it's true. Here I create my navigation stack, which is bound to my router.currentPath. And then here I have my logo. Now here's where the sign-in button logic comes into play. So I say if show sign-in button, then go ahead and show the button. And when that button is clicked, what I want to do is I want to call router.path.append, and I want to use my shared enum.signin. So that's going to launch my navigation stack off to the sign-in screen, which is that custom screen that I just went over. Next I have my button sign-in label, which is coming from my Moco shared string resources. And then finally, if we are signed in, then I want to show the sign out button instead. And when that's clicked, I want to call my sign-in service.signout. So now, how is this show sign-in button flag actually set, true or false? Well, if you remember from before in my sign-in service, I was going over this flow here with this publisher. Well, what I decided to do instead, which is much easier, is we'll go back to the product list here. So I'll go down here, and all the way down at the bottom of my VStack, I can say on receive, let me scroll up a little more. So I can say on receive sign-in service.getPublisher, and then I get this Boolean value, this Kotlin Boolean, and I can say with animation, for show sign-in button, I want to toggle the is user signed in Boolean value. So if they are signed in, I don't want to show the sign-in button, and if they're not, I want to show the sign out button. And this sign-in service.getPublisher, again, is just that convenience function that's in here. So we're using Moco to create the publisher, and we're calling that cflow from the user repo. That's pretty cool stuff. So now we can determine when the user has actually signed in and completed the flow. And if we go back to the product list, this is going to trigger this automatic response between the router and the state variable here and figure out whether we need to navigate or whether we need to show the buttons. And that's pretty much all you need to do to get the sign in with Google and sign in with Apple functionality. As far as the code goes, really it's just a few lines of code, and there's a lot going on in the background as far as the OAuth goes between Google and Apple. So it's really great to have this pre-built UI, and again, you can add a few customizations and play around with the look and feel of it and really get authenticated with Firebase in just a few lines of code. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching.